wind tore across the open plains like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of rain and dust. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she latched the door of the henhouse. The storm was coming fast. The horizon had vanished behind a curtain of dark clouds, and thunder rolled like distant hooves. Her little cabin, crouched alone on the edge of the barren land, groaned under the first lashes of the wind. She hurried back inside, her boots heavy with mud, and pushed the door shut just as the rain began to fall in sheets. Inside, the room was dim. A single lamp flickered on the small table, its flame bending and dancing with every gust that slipped through the gaps in the boards. She moved to the hearth, threw in the last few sticks of firewood she had, and waited for the warmth to return. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth. Outside, the storm deepened, thunder shaking the walls. She sighed and rubbed her arms, wishing she had enough oil to keep the light steady. Then came the sound. A pounding on the door, hard, desperate, as though someone were fighting the wind itself. She froze. No one came this far out during a storm, unless they were lost or running from something. The pounding came again, louder this time. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the fire and moved cautiously toward the door. When she pulled it open, the wind burst in, scattering embers from the hearth and blowing rain across the floorboards. Standing there in the doorway was a man, his hat dripping, his coat plastered to his shoulders. He looked half dead. Mud streaked his face and his lips trembled with cold. His eyes, a strange pale blue, locked on hers with something close to pleading. She didn't ask questions. She stepped aside, motioning him in, and he stumbled past her, nearly collapsing by the fire. She pushed the door shut behind him, bolting it against the storm. The man was shaking violently, his teeth clattering as he tried to catch his breath. She tossed the poker aside, grabbed one of her worn blankets from the cot, and draped it over his shoulders. He tried to speak, but the words broke apart in his throat. His hands, rough and scarred, clutched the blanket as if it were gold. Sarah poured a tin cup of coffee from the pot she kept near the fire, weak and bitter as it was, and held it out to him. He took it with both hands, nearly spilling it, and drank like a man who hadn't tasted warmth in days. When he finally set the cup down, he looked at her properly for the first time. His voice was low and cracked when he spoke. Said he'd been riding from Redwater Creek when his horse stumbled in a ditch, broke its leg, and had to be put down. He'd walked for miles in the freezing rain until he saw the light from her cabin. He apologized for the intrusion, said he'd move on as soon as the storm passed. Sarah studied him in the flicker of the firelight. He looked about 35, maybe older, though the weariness on his face made him seem closer to 50. His clothes were fine ones, what was left of a dark coat, torn and muddy, and boots that had clearly been expensive when new. Not the sort of man who belonged out here among the scrub and wind. But there he was, sitting on her floor, shivering like a child. She turned to the pot simmering on the fire, dipped out a small portion of soup, and placed it before him. It wasn't much. Thin broth, a few pieces of potato, a scrap of rabbit meat, but it was all she had left until morning. The man hesitated, eyes flicking to hers, but hunger won over pride. He ate quickly, quietly, as if ashamed of needing it so badly. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the rain drummed against the roof. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flames dance. It had been weeks since she'd spoken to anyone. The nearest town was nearly a day's ride away, and she didn't have the money to make the trip often. Her days were spent tending the chickens, mending clothes, and praying the winter wouldn't be too cruel. When the man set the empty bowl down, he looked at her again. His voice came softer this time, rough but clear. He thanked her. Then after a moment's pause, he said something that made her heart stop for a beat. Said he didn't want to seem ungrateful, but that he needed something more than food or shelter. That all he wanted was a bit of kindness. Said it quietly, almost like a confession. His eyes cast down at the fire. For a moment, Sarah didn't move. Kindness. That word had a weight she hadn't felt in years. She'd given away food before, patched a traveler's coat, even shared her last bit of coffee with a stranger, but kindness? That was something different, something she hadn't had to spare in a long time. She reached for the pot again, poured the rest of the soup into his bowl, and pushed it gently toward him. Told him he could have it all, she wasn't hungry. He didn't argue. He only looked at her, eyes wet with something that wasn't from the storm, and began to eat again. Slowly this time, as though trying to make the moment last. As he ate, Sarah studied him more closely. His hands were too clean for a ranch hand, too soft for a drifter. His speech wasn't rough like most men she met on the trail, and the ring of gold glinting faintly beneath the dirt on his left hand didn't look like something a poor man would wear. There was a story there, but she didn't ask. Out here, people had reasons for silence. When he finished, he leaned back against the wall, sighing as though the warmth itself had seeped into his bones. She offered him a cot near the fire, saying he could sleep there while she took the chair, but he shook his head, saying he'd slept colder and harder places, that the floor was fine. His tone carried the quiet resolve of someone who'd known both luxury and loss. She insisted once more, but he wouldn't hear it. Finally, too tired to argue, she let him be. She took the chair, wrapping her shawl around herself, and closed her eyes. The sound of the wind outside faded to a dull murmur, the rain softening against the roof. Sometime in the night, she woke to the sound of movement. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. The man was still awake, sitting with his back to the hearth, staring into the flames. His expression was distant, almost haunted. She pretended to sleep, watching him from beneath her lashes. He reached into his coat, pulling out something small. A locket, silver and tarnished. He held it in his palm, thumb brushing over it slowly. Whatever was inside made his face tighten with pain. Then he closed it, slipped it back into his pocket, and leaned his head against the wall, eyes closing at last. Morning came quietly. The storm had passed, leaving a pale frost over the ground. Sarah stirred from her chair, her neck stiff. The fire was dead, only ashes left. The man was gone. The blanket she'd given him was folded neatly by the hearth. For a moment she thought maybe she'd dreamed him, until she saw what lay on the table. A small leather pouch sat there, heavy enough to make the table creak. Next to it was a folded piece of paper. Her name was written across it in careful script. Hands trembling, she opened it. The words were brief, but every one of them carried a weight that made her heart pound. He thanked her for saving a man who'd forgotten what mercy felt like. Said that he was no beggar, but a man who owned half the land she slept on. Said he'd come back one day, not as a stranger, but as a friend, if she'd have him. She stared at the note until her eyes blurred. Then she looked out the window. The land stretched wide and silent, the sun breaking gold through the thinning clouds. Somewhere out there, that man, whoever he really was riding away across the frozen plain. Her cabin was still small, still poor, but somehow it didn't feel so empty anymore. The fire may have gone out, but a different kind of warmth lingered in the air. For the first time in years, Sarah smiled.